Hello everyone. I wish you all a wonderful and peaceful day. Today we will follow the heartwarming story of Mr. Dung as he notices Mrs. Loy watering her flowers every day, but having no comfortable place to sit and rest afterward. Quietly, he decides to build a wooden chair beside the garden so she can relax and enjoy the flowers every afternoon. Will this simple gift make Mrs. Loy truly happy? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Early in the morning, the garden beside the old wooden house was bright with sunlight. The flowers Mrs. Loy had planted were beginning to open, one by one, as if greeting a new day with her. She walked slowly along the narrow path, holding a metal watering can. Her steps were careful, but her face looked peaceful. Every morning she watered each flower, checked the leaves, touched the soil, and smiled whenever she saw a new bud. Mr. Dung stood near the doorway and watched her quietly. He did not say anything at first. He only leaned against the wooden frame, seeing how much joy the garden brought to her. For Mrs. Loy, those flowers were not just plants. They were something to look forward to. They made the yard feel warmer, softer, and more alive. After many days of hard work and worry, the bright colors seemed to give her heart a little rest. But as Mr. Dung watched longer, he noticed something he had not paid attention to before. After watering the flowers, Mrs. Loy always looked around for a place to sit. Sometimes she rested on a low stone near the yard. Sometimes she leaned against a wooden post and held her back with one hand. The garden was beautiful, but there was no proper place for her to sit down, relax, and enjoy it. That small detail stayed in Mr. Dung's mind. Later that morning, while Mrs. Loy went back inside to prepare a meal, Mr. Dung walked around the garden. He looked at the flower bed, the empty corner beside it, and the direction of the afternoon sunlight. He imagined Mrs. Loy sitting there after watering the flowers, resting her tired legs, looking at the blooms, and enjoying the quiet air. The more he thought about it, the more clearly he knew what he wanted to do. He decided to build a wooden chair for her. It did not need to be expensive or fancy. It only needed to be strong, comfortable, and placed in the right spot. To Mr. Dung, that chair would not be just a chair. It would be a small gift made by his own hands for someone who had spent so much time caring for others. He went to the side of the house where old wooden boards had been stacked under a piece of tin roofing. Some boards were rough, some were damp, and a few had cracks along the edges. Mr. Dung picked them up one by one, knocking on the wood with his fingers, checking which pieces were still solid enough to use. He chose the straightest boards for the seat and backrest, then selected thicker pieces for the legs. The yard became quiet except for wood being moved and tools being placed on the ground. Mr. Dung brought out a saw, a hammer, a measuring string, and a box of nails. He squatted beside the wood and began measuring carefully. He did not rush. Every cut had to be right because the chair had to hold Mrs. Loy safely when she sat down. As he measured, he glanced toward the flower garden again. He wanted the chair to face the most beautiful part of the yard, where the flowers were thickest and the afternoon breeze could pass through. He marked the wood with charcoal, then began cutting the first board. The sound of the saw moved through the morning air. Inside the house, Mrs. Loy heard the noise and stepped out. She looked at him with curiosity and asked what he was making. Mr. Dung only smiled and said it was something useful for the garden. He did not explain too much because he wanted her to see it when it was finished. Mrs. Loy laughed softly and went back inside, but her eyes stayed warm with curiosity. Mr. Dung continued working under the sunlight. Sawdust gathered near his feet. His shirt darkened with sweat, but his face remained calm and focused. Piece by piece, the simple shape of a chair began to appear on the ground. It was rough and unfinished, but in Mr. Dung's eyes, it already carried a clear meaning. By midday, the wooden chair had taken a clearer shape. Mr. Dung joined the legs together first, pressing each piece firmly into place before hammering the nails down. He tested the frame with both hands, pushing it from side to side to make sure it would not shake. The chair had to be steady because he knew Mrs. Loy would use it every day after taking care of the flowers. The sun rose higher and the heat spread across the yard. Mr. Dung wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, then continued smoothing the edges of the wood. Some pieces were rough, with small splinters that could scratch Mrs. Loy's hands or clothes. He used an old knife and a piece of sandpaper to rub them down slowly. It took time, but he did not mind. A gift made with care could not be rushed. Mrs. Loy came out again with a bowl of water and told him to rest for a while. She looked at the half-finished chair and finally understood what he was building. Her eyes softened, but she did not say much. She only stood beside him for a moment, watching the chair in silence. Mr. Dung smiled and said that the garden needed a proper seat, so the person who cared for it could also enjoy it. Those simple words made Mrs. Loy lower her head and smile. After a short rest, Mr. Dung returned to work. He fixed the seat boards across the frame, leaving small spaces between them so rainwater could pass through. Then he added a backrest slightly leaning backward so Mrs. Loy could sit more comfortably in the evening. He tested it himself, sitting down carefully, leaning back and pressing his feet against the ground. The chair made a small creaking sound, but it held strong. Still, he was not satisfied. He wanted it to look gentle beside the flowers, not like a rough piece of wood thrown into the yard. So he trimmed the uneven corners and cleaned the dust from the surface. He found a small piece of cloth, dipped it in water, and wiped the boards until the natural color of the wood became warmer. The chair was simple, but it had the feeling of home. In the late afternoon, the sunlight turned soft and golden. Mr. Dung carried the chair to the side of the flower garden. He placed it where Mrs. Loy could see the whole bed of flowers, the small path, and the old wooden house behind them. He moved it a little to the left, then a little to the right, until the view felt just right. When Mrs. Loy came out with her watering can, she stopped as soon as she saw the chair. For a moment, she only looked at it. The flowers swayed lightly in the breeze, and the new wooden chair stood quietly beside them, waiting for her. Mr. Dung took the watering can from her hand and asked her to sit down first. Mrs. Loy sat carefully, touching the arm of the chair with both hands. Her face changed from surprise to happiness. It was not a big thing in the eyes of others, but to her it felt deeply warm. Someone had noticed her tiredness. Someone had quietly understood what she needed. Mr. Dung watered the flowers while Mrs. Loy sat beside the garden, watching him with a gentle smile. The evening breeze moved through the yard, carrying the smell of soil, wood, and fresh leaves. For the first time, Mrs. Loy did not have to stand after watering the flowers. She could sit, rest, and enjoy the beauty she had cared for. As the sun slowly went down, Mr. Dung sat on a low stone near her. They looked at the garden together without many words. The new chair became a small corner of peace in their daily life. It reminded them that happiness did not always come from something grand. Sometimes it came from a simple wooden chair, built with love, placed beside a flower garden for one quiet afternoon of rest. In this episode, Mr. Dung notices a small but meaningful detail in Mrs. Loy's daily routine. Every day, she carefully waters the flowers beside the old wooden house, enjoying the beauty she has created. yet she has no proper place to sit and rest afterward. Seeing her tired but peaceful expression, Mr. Dung quietly decides to build a simple wooden chair near the garden. He chooses old boards, measures each piece, cuts the wood, smooths the rough edges, and works patiently under the sun. Mrs. Loy slowly realizes that the chair is being made for her, and her heart is touched by his care. By late afternoon, the chair is placed beside the blooming flowers. Mrs. Loy sits down, rests, and watches the garden with a gentle smile, feeling love through Mr. Dung's quiet and thoughtful act of love today.